Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Mark Blythe, and I'm the director of the Rhodes Institute, so the Rhodes Center, I should say, at the Watson Institute at Brown University. Welcome to a very snowy day in Providence. We actually have closed the school today, but nonetheless, we've managed to get a bunch of you on Zoom to come to this talk today by Fiona Hill. So we're delighted to have Dr. Hill here with us today. The obligatory bio reading, I will do this now. Fiona Hill is Senior Fellow at the Center on the United States and Europe and Foreign Policy Programme at Brookings. She recently served as Assistant to the President and Senior Director on European and Russian Affairs for the National Security Council from 2017 to 2019. From 2006 to 2009, she served as National Intelligence Officer for Russia and Eurasia at the National Intelligence Council. And she is author of this remarkable book, There Is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. I don't know if you can even see it on there, but there we go. We won't track it. How interesting is that? Nonetheless, we had envisaged coming here and talking about the book because it's a really great book, and we are going to talk. We're going to start off with the book, but obviously when you have one of the country's foremost Russia scholars with you and Russia experts with you, policy experts, and given given the invasion, let's just call it what it is, of course, we're going to talk about that as well. So before we get started, a little bit of housekeeping. Those of you who are on the feed from Brown, you're internal to the Zoom. We're going to talk for about 35 minutes. Fiona's going to talk a little bit about the book first. Then we're going to have a kind of moderated conversation between the two of us because there's some aspects we want to get out onto the table that we've already chatted about. And then we're just going to go to Q&A. So you can just basically put it in the Q&A or put it in the chat or whatever you want to. I'll be looking at that and I'm happy to relay that. This is also going out on YouTube Live. So if anyone who's out there wants to ask a question, just put it in the comments section and we've got people watching that and that will get dumped into the chat as well. So I think I've covered most of the bases. So I think that's it. So welcome, Fiona. Despite the snow, you made it down, which is great. Let's start talking about this remarkable book. And I'm using the word remarkable. Let me say why it's remarkable. It combines a very personal autobiography with a very powerful analysis of the forces that propelled Trump to power. But more than that, this is a movie you've seen before because you start off in Bishop Auckland, outside of Durham, in a mining village in the 1970s and 1980s. And then from there, you go to Russia and you see the same movie again. And then finally, you start to see the movie in the United States. And that's when your warning bells start going off. So let's just start with that. Tell me about how you made those connections.
Well, thanks, Mark. And first of all, I just want to say I'm really delighted to actually be here. In fact, Mark and I are just in different rooms of his house doing this right now. It's a little ironic, really, but I did make it down the snow. I'm wearing my hoodie. I hope nobody will mind. We're not dressed up for this, but the snow's still going outside, but I couldn't miss this opportunity to actually be in Providence, Rhode Island, even if I'm actually doing it by Zoom. But anyway, this is this is great. And this is also, I have to say, because Professor Blythe, Mark, is also from sort of my neck of the woods. And one of the most memorable conversations we had way back when, because we're sort of contemporaries in sort of time and space, Mark is from Dundee in Scotland, which is the town just across the River Tay from where I actually went to university in St Andrews, and once the universities of St Andrews and Dundee were in the same university complex. And when we met up in the United States, having both come to the United States to do graduate school and eventually to stay here, we were having a whole conversation about the places that we came from, the working class backgrounds that we both came from, in Mark's case in the East Nuke of Fife, and me from the northeast of England. And Mark very poignantly quipped, because we were both interested in Soviet studies and the Soviet Union and its collapse and deindustrialization, that his hometown of Dundee was the Dnipropetrovsk of the United Kingdom. Dnipropetrovsk, now known as Dnipro, which is a city just south of Kiev on the Dnieper River, which is no doubt right now being bombarded by the Russian military. And I had actually started to study Russian, and I just want to sort of tell this story because it all kind of links together to where we are today. Back in 1984, against the backdrop of the British miners' strike, 1984 to 1985 was the biggest industrial action in the United Kingdom after the 1926 general strike. And my father, having been a coal miner, had lost his job multiple times. By this time, he wasn't a miner anymore. He was working in the local hospital at the lowest rung of the economic labour market ladder as a hospital porter. And the miners' strike had a massively devastating effect on what was left of the coal industry in the northeast of England and in and around my town. But the miners of various different massive coal fields around the world raised money for the kids of miners and the family of miners. And one of those groups of miners happened to be the miners of the Donbass, one of the Soviet Union then's largest coal fields. The other was the Kuzbass in Siberia. And I happened to get some money from the miners of the Donbass Fund to go and study Russian for the very first time once I decided to study Russian, to go and have a Russian language course. So I want to put that out there because it was already in my early part of my life a connection there that I hadn't thought about, just as you, Mark, was sort of starting to think about these big industrial countries and what happens to them as time moves on. So the northeast of England, where I grew up, in this, I was multiple generations of miners. As a girl, I was unlikely to be a miner anyway, but even if I'd been a boy, I wouldn't have been able to follow my dad, my uncles, my great uncles, my granddad, and all my great grandfathers, etc., down the coal mines because the mines were starting to close. And every major industry in the northeast of England was nationalized. I don't think people kind of fully process this, even in the United Kingdom or outside of the United Kingdom, that I basically grew up in the functional equivalent of the Soviet Union in the northeast of England. Because after World War II, when the private industries were faltering after the devastation of 5 years of being cut off from the global economy, the owners of the steelworks and the shipyards and the coal mines had been bankrupted, and they didn't have the money, basically to revitalize the industry, so the British government had to step in. And fast forward from 1945 and onwards, when they were nationalized, to 1965, when I'm born, all of those industries, not surprisingly, being sort of centrally planned, were not competitive. Or even if they were competitive, they needed to be modernized and brought into the later part of the 20th century. And so when Margaret Thatcher comes along in 1979 and starts this mass privatization, and that reduces, obviously, or results rather in reduced operations, automation, and an awful lot of layoffs, the northeast of England is devastated, because hundreds of thousands of people working in these British coal, British steel, British shipyards, British rail, all lose their jobs at once. And my dad says to me in 1984, when I'm leaving school, against the backdrop of a worsening unemployment crisis in the UK, but especially in the northeast of England, and a 90% crisis for British youth at that time leaving school, meaning that 90% of school leavers are not going to have a job to go on to, not immediately anyway. There's nothing for you here, Pet, the title of the book, without the pet. There's nothing for you here. If you've got qualifications, you go off to university, you get a degree, you can't come back here, you're going to have to go somewhere else for opportunity and to find a job. And as Mark just said in the introduction, that something else ends up with me studying Russian, going off to St Andrews University, just across the river from Dundee, the Dnipropetrovsk of the East Nuke of Scotland, where Dundee shipbuilding and other heavy industry is also closing down as well. And then I was studying history and Russian language, but I get a scholarship to Russia in 1987, 1988. And I suddenly see that the Soviet Union is falling apart as well. It wasn't what I expected. I expect this to be the great industrial superpower, the nuclear superpower. And I get to the Soviet Union and central planning has run out of steam. There's nothing in the shops, not because people don't want anything. There's plenty of demand there, unlike in the northeast of England, where nobody has any money to buy anything, so the shops are empty or boarded up. But here, central planning has reached basically the end of its life. This is a period of economic scarcity, of deficits in the economy, and you can see that the whole place is crumbling because there's been no major capital investment in Moscow for decades. Sounds familiar, of course, right? When we start to think about, the place of our infrastructure is falling apart here in the US as well because of a lack of capital investment by the state over many years in roads and bridges, etc. The Soviet Union is literally falling apart. And I start to think, this is interesting. That's just like the northeast of England, but just on a massive scale. And then in 1989, just a little bit before Mark comes over to the United States as well, I get this amazing scholarship to Harvard. I'm thinking, the great door of opportunity opened for me through education to a whole new life. And all I do is step outside of Harvard Yard to places like Somerville and Medford. And Providence, Rhode Island was very similar in the same period as I learned when I come down on a train trip here to see Providence way back when. And deindustrialization is taking place here as well. And the people who are renting out their rooms to students, to graduate students living in old wooden triple deckers. If I look outside of Mark's window here, I can see a few of these here as well. These are the houses that they bought for their families in the boom times when everybody was working in meatpacking plants, auto manufacturing, brickworks, and all kinds of, further afield in Massachusetts, textile industries and heavy manufacturing. And they're going through the same process just a little bit later. And people are trying to keep their families together or have some extra money by renting out the rooms in what used to be their family homes. And so I'm seeing the same kind of phenomenon. So although I'm not an economist, like Professor Blythe is, I'm a historian, I'm studying Russian, but I'm somebody who is living through deindustrialization, and I'm seeing the patterns occurring in many other places.
Now link us up to the United States. You basically have a very successful career and you start to notice the same things there. How does that twig? What twigs that for you?
Well, first of it all, it's just that, there's 4 hours outside of Harvard Yard walking through, Massachusetts, but I kind of think, well, the Northeast corridor of the United States, but like the Northeast of England, I'm not sure that it's like this everywhere else. Mm-hmm. But then, I acquire over time an American boyfriend who's from the Midwest. He becomes my husband. So I acquire a very large extended American family from the Midwest. And I start to go out to what used to be the American industrial heartland. And by the time I'm starting to go there into the 1990s and into the 2000s, what has been the American heartland becomes the American Rust Belt. And I start to notice patterns there too, that the big manufacturing industries in the United States, the auto manufacturing plants, the big steel works, all of the mills. I don't, see so many of the coal mines until I start to kind of visit Pennsylvania a little bit, kind of later in my life in the United States. But then I start to see the same thing in Pennsylvania, the Lehigh Valley. I kind of realized that the United States at a slightly different cycle is going through exactly what I'd experienced back in the 70s and 80s in the UK, and what I'd seen in the Soviet Union in the late 80s, and I saw as an academic and an expert in the 1990s in post-Soviet Russia, where they were trying to transfer the economy from heavy industry, mass manufacturing, state-run industry into a private sector industry, and also to modernize and automate, and the same patterns happening there too. But a few things really struck me about what I started to see in the old industrial heartlands of the United States as well, is that, and again, this might seem paradoxical to people, but remember, I've grown up in an environment that was dominated by nationalized industry. And I've been studying a country that is dominated by nationalized industry, because that's what the Soviet Union is, a centrally planned state-run economy until the 1990s. It occurs to me as I'm looking at these big manufacturing plants, the auto plants and others in particular, and even all sorts of the coal mines, that the whole economy of regions has grown up around them. And that everything that people do, their culture, their identity, the schools, the churches, you name it, they're all tied to these workplaces, just like they were in the north of England, just like they were in the Soviet Union, just minus the churches during the Soviet period, because they'd been turned into warehouses and other things. But anyway, they come back, over time. And also, because of the nature of the US healthcare system, people's well-being is also tied to their workplace. Because the United States, unlike the United Kingdom, that built up the National Health Service after World War II as part of this nationalization effort to kind of, take care of people's health and welfare after all the deprivations of the war. In the United States, the decision is actually made to tie people's health to the workplace through their welfare benefits, their health benefits. And that means that people are shackled to their workplace, which actually happens in the Soviet Union as well. Now, again, suspend a bit of disbelief if you're kind of listening to this and just kind of try not to understand it. But the Soviet Union also has a national health system, but it's tied to your workplace, because your clinic and all of the doctors are all tied to the place where you work. If you're in a town that is dominated by a major factory, the town clinic is linked to the factory. And if you're in Flint, Michigan, or, just kind of thinking about, coal mining town in, West Virginia or anything else, your health benefits are actually tied to your workplace, because you get the benefits for healthcare through having work. And once you lose your work, you lose your health benefits. And in the Soviet Union, when the Soviet Union fell apart as well, people didn't lose their health benefits per se, but they actually lost their access to the clinics, because a lot of those closed down as well. And the doctors and nurses might have gone off to do something else, become a taxi driver or open a kiosk, or actually have brain drain to somewhere else. So I started to kind of see that the same patterns were repeating themselves in very specific places. Although a lot of the United States obviously bounced back, and a lot of people would say, look, 2/3 of the US economy, even after the pandemic, is doing really well. What about that 1/3 of people who are not? And they were in many respects suffering from the same problems that people in the northeast of England and even across Russia were, especially in the 1990s and even since. We were seeing the same phenomenon of people suffering from socioeconomic dislocation because of the effects of deindustrialization and no new industry coming back into the kind of the places that had been previously dominated, heavily dominated by the manufacturing sector. And of course, Mark, Professor Blythe, that's some of the stuff that you've been writing about for quite some time. Not surprisingly, because you came from the Dnipropetrovsk of the southern part of Scotland.
Yeah, well, back in the day when we kind of made that joking remark to each other, I actually looked into it afterwards. And it turns out that Dundee might have the claim to be the first town in the West to actually deindustrialize. Because our major industry was actually jute packaging. And along came nylon in 1945, and it just blew up the entire thing. So the factory started to shut down as early as the 50s. So when the Brits were having sort of, you've never had it so good, that town was already going down.
Right.
Now, the latter part of your book is partly it's the personal journey, etc. But there's this strange confluence of forces that bring you to the White House at the same time that Trump arrives in the White House. So can you link those two things together? How is it that this deindustrialization, that 1/3 of the country, ends up propelling what you will call an authoritarian reaction?
Well, first of all, how on earth did I end up here, as I relate in the book? I was extraordinarily lucky to be able to have access to an education because, back in the day, Mark, you and I would have had the same experience. Although only 5 to 6% of kids went to university, when you and I were starting out and leaving school, and we went to schools that were not exactly producing, the university graduate types when we left. Our local education authorities would actually pay for education for fees and also maintenance grants, housing, living allowance for students like us who came from impoverished backgrounds. And so, we would be a tiny fraction of the 5 to 6% of kids from the UK at large who were going to university, but we did get everything paid for us. And then I get a scholarship to Harvard in 1989. So I have the unbelievable good fortune of having my education paid for, graduating without any debt, and I decided to study Russian against the backdrop of an event like we have today, against the crisis at the height of the Cold War, the Euro missiles, the placing of SS-20 and Pershing missiles in Europe by the United States and the Soviet Union, respectively. It's the other way around, actually. Soviet Union with SS-20s, the United States with Pershing missiles. That really created a major war scare in November of 1983, very similar to where we are now with President Putin promising to blow everybody up potentially with a nuclear weapon, but most likely with a nuclear weapon with that threat if anybody intervenes in Ukraine. And against this kind of backdrop, I talk in the book about my great uncle Charlie, who was actually an older cousin of my dad, but in the northeast of England, like in many other places, everyone's related to each other, and anyone who's older than you call uncle because the chances are they are your uncle. But anyway, my great uncle Charlie had fought during World War II and been in the merchant marine convoys, some of them went out of Dundee as well, to supply the Soviet Union during the height of the war at the very end when the Soviet Union was fighting off the Germans. And he couldn't understand how we'd gone from being wartime allies to being on the verge of blowing each other up. And he basically was trying to understand this. I was trying to understand this too. And he said to me, why don't you go and study Russian and figure it out? Well, anyway, here I am. Obviously, I haven't figured it out too well because here we are yet again, with not the Soviet Union, but Russia and Putin invading Ukraine. And, it's, anyway, I can't explain it, but it's a very long and involved story. But this actually starts to propel me forward in my life, armed with a Harvard degree, working at the Kennedy School of Government while I was at Harvard, getting a job at the Brookings Institution, ending up in the National Intelligence Council, studying Mr. Putin and the Russians, writing a book on Mr. Putin operative in the Kremlin with another Brookings colleague. And in 2016, when Mr. Putin and the Russian security services decide to interfere in our election, I get asked, rather surprisingly, to come into the Trump administration, including by an awful lot of people I'd worked in the government with previously, because my previous tenure in government had spanned the last few years of the Bush administration and the first year of the Obama administration, not partisan, not ideological. People knew me from working there, thought I was a straight shooter, and would I come in to help, to see if we could figure out to push back against the Russians, notwithstanding everything that was kind of going on at the surface. And I'd already seen Trump coming, as it were, because of all of these experiences back in the northeast of England, watching what was happening with Putin coming into office. He came into office just as I joined the Brookings Institution in 2000. Also watching through my lens of my very large extended family in the Midwest, and I've actually got some other distant relatives from the UK who live in the kind of Rust Belt, New Jersey and Ohio, and others that I've kind of been in touch with in Pennsylvania. And a lot of them were feeling the same kind of grievances and irritation that people back home in the Northeast were feeling. And many people that I knew back at home, including relatives and people and friends in my hometown, voted for Brexit. But the same kinds of impulses, even though these are often very different situations, that led people to vote for Trump. Mm-hmm. And many of my extended family were expressing exactly the same grievances. They're saying that the elites aren't listening to us. We don't see ourselves reflected in government. The Democrats have forgotten about the working class. This guy's out there and he's talking to us about bringing jobs back. At least he's listening to us. He's, promising coal miners and steel workers and others that they'll get their jobs back. He's kind of selling a lifestyle, and he's also channeling grievance. Mm-hmm. And in Brexit in 2016, I mean, Mark, you'll be, thinking about this as well, because, same sort of phenomenon. People in places like Dundee, places like the northeast of England, were being told that the reason that there wasn't being investment, actually in Scotland is slightly different than the northeast of England, but they were being told that basically wasn't any investment, no new industry coming in, because all of their money was going to Brussels and then was paying for Bulgarians and Romanians and Poles and others who were coming in and taking jobs that otherwise workers in the northeast of England might get, and taking away investment, which wasn't true. Although there was some element in that people of truth in the fact that people from the northeast of England used to go down and work in London on sort of construction brigades for a period of time, staying in, little B&Bs, bed sits, 5 or 6 of them to a room. And they would be working on construction sites and bringing, the kind of money back home after a few weeks. And those jobs did get taken away, not just by the ubiquitous Polish plumber that was always being talked about in London, but, later by Bulgarian and Romanian construction workers, and interesting enough, later Ukrainian construction workers. And so people from my hometown were electricians and plumbers and worked on, it wasn't, you don't do much air conditioning in Britain, but heating systems and things, who would have gone down and done a job in London, suddenly found that they'd been displaced. And that did build into a lot of the resentment. So a lot of the votes in Brexit are against Europeans coming in through the open labour markets of the EU, that the British government had basically embraced for people in London to get cheaper construction and cheaper services. And that basically priced out the other guys, from the northeast of England and Scotland and other places who would have gone down to London. So there was all that kind of element there. So there is that anti-immigrant element. It's not the same as it was in, obviously in the United States, and that's kind of idea of people taking their jobs. But there was an element of that in as well. And what's interesting, of course, is Donald Trump himself is in the United Kingdom during Brexit. He's up in Turnberry, his golf course outside of Scotland, and he predicts that the United States will have its Brexit moment. And all the kind of elites sitting around in think tanks are going, oh, what's the man talking about? What do you mean his Brexit moment? The United States isn't in the European Union. But what he meant, of course, was the backlash from the disaffected. And it's not just those who've been socioeconomically displaced, of course, in the United States. It's kind of the cultural and identity aspect of this. It's billionaires who wanted to see less regulation. Same thing happening with Brexit, of course, as well. Business people, including like Trump, who was always railing against EU regulation because of his golf courses in Turnberry and Doonbeg and Ireland, etc., who are also voting for this. But that groundswell of grievance from the people who've been dislocated in the old industrial areas actually tips the balance. And you can prove it in the case of the United States. It's not Mr. Putin who elects Trump in 2016, despite the interference. It's about 70,000 American voters in 3 counties in 3 of the most deindustrialized states in the United States.
So, a lack of investment, a collapse of local social services and opportunities. You see this both in the UK case and the US case. But Putin seems to have inherited that and then turned it into something else entirely. It's kind of like, if you will, a weaponized version of Trump. As you
Yes.
say in the book, he very much admires authoritarians. And what we have now is an authoritarian who's willing, quite willing to use force. How do we get from there, what you've just described, to Putin? How does Putin square the circle on this? I checked the other day, just before the invasion, his ratings were 65%. Western politicians would crawl across broken glass to get 65% in the ratings. So, how did that happen? What's the trick that he pulled? How did he pull it together?
Well, first of all, a quick note on Trump, who was basically recently declared Putin still as a genius and being very savvy, because Trump admired, as I describe in the book, Putin for being strong and powerful, which he was repeatedly saying, and being an autocrat. And, Trump basically has, as one of my colleagues, recently described, a Hobbesian worldview, which Putin has as well. And the whole idea is, well, might makes right, the little people suffer. If you have power, you get to use it. And the people like the Trumps and Putins of the world, you live in a different environment, in which they're highly justified by being strong and powerful to actually do the things that they do. And Trump looked at Putin with this degree of what I also describe as autocrat envy, wanted to be him. And it wasn't really about Russia or any of the things that Russia was doing, but it was more about how he saw himself as a leader. And we heard over and over and over again about, including the tapes with Bob Woodward in preparation for his book, about basically Trump saying that I like, the worse they are, the more I like them. Maybe you'll explain it to me sometime, Bob. The others, look like weaklings. So even now, against the backdrop of the devastation of Ukraine, Trump has been praising Putin. Now with Putin, 65%, as you say, popularity ratings before the war, that's actually kind of low for Putin. And Putin always worries if his ratings flag, because that's probably not the real reflection of his popularity. Because when people are asked in polls, as we all know ourselves, in the United States, polling is a bit of an art, not an exact science. There's always that plus or minus variation from the mean. There's also people who, when they been asked a question, think, why is this person asking me this? You have to have focus groups often have to back this up as well. Because I might say, they just asked me whether I love Russia or not, because Putin has become, after 22 years, so wrapped up with Russia that people are going to say, yeah, absolutely. Sometimes, they might be thinking, well, wow, if, somebody taking my name off, they're not obviously, but telephone calls of someone listening, what if I say I don't like Putin, what's going to happen here? Other times it's just not any other opposition figure or something out there. But sometimes what you get is a better reflection is, what do you think of the performance of the government or of other individuals, around in the government, the prime minister and others, and those are often much lower ratings. And then you look at the turnout for elections. And the recent elections for the kind of equivalent of midterms for the Russian Duma show a pretty low turnout. And, kind of the United Russia Party, although it seems to get a super majority in the parliament, it isn't it's like in British politics, first past the post, or it's like, Trump and others winning through the Electoral College. This really doesn't, kind of fill you with the fact that the majority of Russians are in support. So you take the 65% or 60% with a bit of a grain of salt, and Putin does that too. And it's important for him to be able to show, because Russia is in some respects almost a plebiscitary democracy, that he is extremely popular. Mm-hmm. And the last time that he had lowish ratings, and maybe it's more in the 40, 50% perhaps, depending on, how you judged it based on turnout and where he was getting, the votes, he always does worse in Moscow and St. Petersburg, for example, in the big cities, and better in the old industrial heartland, in the Rust Belt, yep. And in, places like Chechnya, where sometimes he gets 110% of the vote because, the guys there have gone out and overfulfilled the plan, and, all kind of starts to show up in funny numbers. He invaded Ukraine before, annexed Crimea, and got a big bump from this, and his ratings went through the roof. High 80s, 90%. They've gone back down again, as is the law of physics. And, will this boost his ratings or not? Because he's 2 years out from 2024 when he has to re-legitimate himself. Right. There's no political party for Putin. He's guaranteed by the Constitution as being the most important institution as the president. in the whole of Russia, there's very few checks and balances, but it's his popularity that counts. So if only 20–30% of the population in real life actually support him, that's not good, because that, kind of reduces his legitimacy as the strong man, the powerful man in the circle around him. That's why Trump was always so paranoid. He didn't want to look like a loser. Putin always has to look like a winner. And that's kind of where we are right now with Ukraine as well. But how he's turned things around, saying from the 1990s, is that basically Putin comes in 1999, the end of 1999, as the designated successor to Boris Yeltsin. The country's bankrupt. Yeltsin has literally died in office and been revived. I mean, the last election, he had a massive heart attack and had to undergo open heart surgery. Everyone was told he had a cold, why he wasn't seen for quite some time. And so Putin is selected here to try to turn things around. He has to protect Yeltsin and all of the kind of the corruption around the Yeltsin family, which he actually does. Lots of people out there think that they can kind of manipulate him, that he's this guy who's kind of stepping in from nowhere, but of course he isn't from nowhere, he's from the KGB. And the first thing that Putin does in those first 2 terms of presidency is pay off Russia's debts, make it solvent again. He benefits from a rise in oil prices and gas prices along with them that Yeltsin didn't have. The Russian state went bankrupt when oil was about $10 or so a barrel. Under Putin, it goes off into the triple figures, well over $100 a barrel, up as perhaps as far as 120, 150, where oil is trending right now during this crisis. And so Putin makes the country solvent again and gets people back into work. There's an awful lot of people working for the state. He starts to turn the military around, and the military is also the military-industrial complex. And it's not just the number of people who are under arms, it's all the people who go back to tank factories, the people who go back to missile factories, and all of the people involved in that. Because oil and gas, you only have 1 to 2% of the workforce. When you get into the military-industrial complex, you have a much bigger percentage in that manufacturing center. So it's a jobs program, as well as it is a rebuilding program of the Russian military. And in 2007, when Putin goes to the Munich Security Conference and makes the infamous speech that everyone's talking about now about Russia's back, Russia really is back. It's paid off its debts. It started to build up its military. And now Putin starts to think of the other aspect of make Russia great again, which we're dealing with today.
So we started to get some people raising hands, and I want to bring them into the conversation. But just let's get into this now, and let's get into it in a particular way that we were talking about earlier. You were suggesting that one of the ways to think about this crisis and Russia's behavior just now is that we should be thinking about a kind of 19th century world rather than a 21st century world. So what do you mean by that? Let's get that on the table, and then we'll start to bring in people with questions.
Yeah, we could actually take it back, even further. I mean, we were talking about the pre-revolutionary Russia. And, obviously, to go up until the early 20th century. But basically, the Russian economic system remains surprisingly feudal. And, what I mean by that is what you and I were talking about earlier, is that the oligarchs we're always talking about, and that in itself could take some unpacking, they're actually more the stewards and manager of assets than they are the outright owners of the companies that they sit on top of. In fact, many of them, came out of the old Soviet system, and many of the sectors in which they dominate, they were actually in the old Soviet ministry. So take Vagit Alekperev, for example, the head of Lukoil. He was in the Soviet energy ministry before. And then when we got some of the new owners there, and you and I were talking about Mikhail Jodakovsky, who most people will now kind of more think about as being, the dissident, the former businessman who ended up in a penal colony for 10 years after a sort of spat with Putin. When he took over the Russian energy company Yukos as part of a conglomerate of investors, after a period of time, what Mikhail Jodakovsky wanted to do was transform Yukos into a kind of modern energy company, make it a kind of competitor with other major energy companies. And he was also getting to the point where he was thinking about selling not just a stake in Yukos, which he actually did to a whole bunch of Western investors, including British Petroleum, BP, but in fact, even maybe selling the company outright. And this is basically the period when Putin and the Russian state step in. Mm-hmm. And in the run-up to Jodakovsky actually getting arrested. He was getting onto one of his planes, out there near one of the energy installations. And Jodakovsky had already been warned that he was kind of in trouble, but he didn't want to leave the country. And at one point, he'd been the poster child for the Russian oligarchs. He'd been out and about, basically touting, the virtues of the new economy in Russia and the energy sector. And, people were looking at him and thinking, and he was transforming the company. And this is what was going to happen with the whole of Russian industry and the new private sector. It was going to come more and more like the West, and they were going to float IPOs and people could invest. And this was a whole brave new world. One Russian said to me, the problem for Jodakovsky is going to be in trouble because he thinks he owns it. He thinks he owns UCOS and it's his to sell. And in fact, that's what happened, is the Russian government, Putin, they step in, they expropriate him because it wasn't his to sell. He'd forgotten the rules of the old feudal system in Russia, if you want to call it that, of when the boyars, the aristocrats, the landed gentry, their land, and often the businesses that they had off the land, the industries, the salt mines, literally, and others that they might have concessions to. There were concessions, there were licenses to the crown, to the czars. They served and they owned their property at the pleasure of the czar. They weren't really outright landowners. They might have some that was given to them, which in fact many of the oligarchs have some of the things that are given to them, or they're allowed to buy, like in the case of Ruslan Abramovich, Chelsea Football Club, soccer team. And, it's not that they're necessarily directed by the Kremlin to do that, but, kind of they're given the opportunity to go and buy, something that they can, kind of run separately. But the main bulk of assets that are there in the crown jewels of energy, oil and gas and metallurgy and these other, kind of major industries, those are really still the Kremlin's, Putin's, the czars to cash in on or to call in favors.
So link that to Ukraine. How should we be thinking about Ukraine? Because we have this idea of rights and sovereignty and norms and responsibility. If you put it in that feudal framework, how is Russia thinking about Ukraine?
Well, Putin's made it very clear today that Ukraine is not its own, that the Ukrainians made the mistake of thinking that they owned Ukraine and that they could, in a way, sell it. And what does he mean by that, selling it? Because obviously the Ukrainians weren't really interested in selling themselves. But what he means is moving over to the European Union or to NATO and basically running the country as if they owned it. Putin has made it crystal clear. And if there was any doubt about it, people just go and look about, basically what he's been saying, not just today, but over, the last sweep of a few days when I hope people's eyes have opened up to all of this, that just like Mikhail Hodorkovsky, the Ukrainians and Volodymyr Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, are finding that the Russian state, the Tsar in the Kremlin, thinks that Ukraine is actually his and is just been and has been managed by them until he calls in the chips or calls in the demands. And basically it's unacceptable for Ukraine to have sold itself, essentially had itself transferred as a piece of property for the Kremlin to, basically, let's just say another franchise, the European Union or NATO.
Yeah.
I say the European Union because all of this, last rounds of slicing and dicing up Ukraine, the other invasion for the annexation of Crimea, the war in Donbass that was started off, was because the Ukraine pursued not NATO membership at the time, but an association agreement with the European Union. And the Russians at that time determined that was a backdoor into NATO because of common security and defense policy provisions in the EU. And if Ukraine had persisted in seeking its NATO membership immediately after 2008, when it was given this open door policy at the Bucharest NATO summit, like Georgia did, Russia would have invaded them as well. Yeah. Because what Putin was trying to say is, you're in our group, you're in our franchise, kind of taking this out. You guys have just, kind of acquired this at the pleasure of the Tsar, and you're not going anywhere else. And I'm afraid it is as crude as that. And all you have to do is look very carefully at the language that Putin is using here. And now he's basically doing what they did to Jodakovsky. I'm including the idea that, the Ukrainian leadership will either be assassinated or put in a penal colony in a prison because they had the temerity to think that Ukraine was theirs.
So on that happy note, I'm going to ask Tony Levitas to come off his mic and ask his question, and I'm going to bring in Eric Brown and Richard Boucher. If anyone else on the call, we got lots of people on this call want to ask a question, please put it into the Q&A or the chat. Go ahead, Tony.
Hi, Dr. Hill, Fiona, if I may. It's a pleasure to listen to you. It's a shock and a surprise to hear this other side of you and then to imagine it in motion with our own Mark Blyth. And there are so many things that I would love to ask you about Ukraine, you know, the dog of anti-Semitism that hasn't barked, the remarkable flip-flop of Ukraine's oligarchs in 2014 as the first defenders against incursion. But let me try and ask a question that connects the thriving Donbass of your youth to the implications of its festering hole now. I mean, it is kind of the archetype of the Russian Rust Belt.
It is, absolutely, yeah.
And, you know, the two Ukraines that everybody talks about as being Russian and Ukrainian in many ways are the Ukraines of the Rust Belt, with all the resentment, the deaths of despair, the alcoholism, the drug abuse, the exodus of people, the aging of the population that produced the initial divide and arguably produced much of the initial divide in Ukraine. And arguably is now the same group of resentful youth from similar families that is the Russian army. And you've mentioned, you know, how we're not sure how brittle the support is for Putin at home, and there are good reasons to suspect that body bags will not be seen lightly in the same way as there's a backlash against American intervention in the world. My guess is the sentiment in Russia is that, you know, we'd like to be great again, but not if it's going to cost us body bags. And I'm just wondering how deeply you think the resentment that's on the one hand responsible for the MAGA version of Putin in some way is brittle and fragile.
I think that's a really great question, Tony. And actually, I mean, it is very interesting, actually, what you just said at the very beginning about the dog of anti-Semitism that didn't bark. Ukraine, not so recently, was the only country outside of Israel to have not just a Jewish president, but a Jewish prime minister. And
Jewish oligarchs.
And Jewish oligarchs, exactly. But, you know, the president and the prime minister, pretty significant there. And this
right.
Volodymyr Zelensky, a Jewish president. I hope he's still with us, you know, as we're still speaking here.
Right.
But this was the kind of also the new Ukraine, a very different Ukraine from the Ukraine past of Babyn Yar and, you know, the period of the bloodlands that Tim Snyder, you know, has written so brilliantly about. And I think that also annoyed the heck out of Putin because, you know, they're still out there saying that they're trying to denazify Ukraine because, I mean, they could point, of course, to, you know, the Ukrainian nationalists and, you know, the history of the Black Hundreds and the pogroms and the nationalist forces in World War II in Ukraine. But Ukraine is a much more complex place, as indeed Russia itself is. The second part of your question is unfolding. And when they first went into, you know, Donbass and outside of Crimea, where obviously, you know, that transferred pretty quickly without any bullets being fought, and they'd obviously done their homework, again, a population of Crimea and where some of the bulk of sympathies lay. In Donbass, exactly right, they thought that they could play onto this sort of populist grievance. Donbass, you know, like Dundee and the northeast of England, was also kind of a melting pot of people going into work there. I mean, Mark and I were talking about this earlier. I tend to say Blythe rather than, you know, your pronunciation of his last name, because his name comes from Northumberland. There was the town called Blythe. And it's, you know, all these people who moved around forever looking for jobs and ending up in industrial places like Dundee or Newcastle on Tyne or Donetsk and Luhansk, and they come from all over the place, and they're Soviets and they're Russian speakers, but they might have different ethnicities, but they might not think about it, but they think of their linkage to be the Soviet Union. It's very similar, frankly, in Northern Ireland, in Belfast and elsewhere, where the Ulster Unionists are the Scots and others, who have moved into the shipyards of Belfast and the big industries, and who don't feel particularly any affinity with the more rural part of now the Republic of Ireland. And when Ireland declares independence, they don't want to go. I mean, it's like the sort of the Donbass as well, and they don't really want to go. They want to be there still with the mainland. And that's kind of Donbass still wanted to be in part with the mainland, as Crimea sort of thought it might want to be. And it's all more complicated than that, but that's the kind of, as you're saying here, some of the mentality. And when there is this somewhat support for the declaration of sovereignty by these rebels, the proxy forces from Russia, a lot of people did hope that Russia would annex them as well, like it had with Crimea, and that they'd kind of get jobs back, get dignity back, know who they were again, that they wouldn't be living in a rust belt. There'd be investment in the mines and the basic manufacturing. And instead, they've had 7-8 years of war, 14,000 people killed, and now they're getting even more war, and they're being used.
And in the meantime, being treated like shit by Putin.
Exactly right. And so now many of them are not thinking the same way. So we get to the last part of your point here. And yeah, we're going to see, aren't we, whether people do still feel the same way of, they're basically supporting Putin. They've bought into the idea that this is all NATO and the United States, that Ukraine's just collateral damage, a proxy war between the US and NATO, and that somehow, for Ukraine to be saved, it has to be pummeled and, forced into submission. And then you take out the Nazi, fascist, Jewish, Russian-speaking president, and then, Ukraine is liberated, and all kinds of wonderful things are going to blow out grow out all over the place. But at the same time, you have 11, million people in Russia who, in various censuses have described themselves as ethnically Russian. You have Ukrainian rather. You have, 3 million Ukrainian citizens working in Russia, and you have lots of people in Russia who have relatives in Ukraine. And they may not be just all Russian speaking, Ukrainian speaking, but this is their grannies and their uncles and aunts and maybe their own parents who are getting bombarded in Kiev and Kharkiv. It's not just the conscripts and the soldiers, the contract soldiers who are going to come home in body bags. It's what about your granny in Dnipro? Or, what about your aunt in Kharkiv, or your uncle in Mykolaiv or something like this? Or all of your extended family or cousins in Odessa. What's going to happen there? Is this
Your kid on the front?
Exactly. So we'll have to see. I mean, obviously what Putin is thinking is this is his version of blitzkrieg, and he's going to get these to force a surrender. We're all going to surrender and pull back. And then what? So I'm
how far?
Tony, I'm going to have to ask you to cut out at this point because I've got other people waiting too.
Yeah, but I think Tony's on the right page here. As we watch this unfold, we're going to have to be asking ourselves, and in fact, we should openly ask these questions and be asking them, across the heads of all of the warmongers here about, well, how is this going to play out for you?
Eric Brown, do you want to come off?
Oh, hey, Eric.
Hello. Yes, thank you so much for coming to speak, albeit virtually. I wanted to ask quickly on your note of this need for Putin to always feel popular, and his recent meeting with Russian oligarchs and elites, and then domestic protests over the last 24 hours seem to indicate at least a few cracks sort of in this popularity of war. But given Putin's sheer consolidation of power, does a level of domestic resistance even exist that can impact his decision-making? It's clear that he owns the elite, not the other way around. So is there anything that the oligarchs or the Russian public can do that sort of makes this, invasion, this decision seem unpopular? Thank you.
Well, Eric, you're spot on. It links to Tony's point as well, doesn't it? Because it's going to be very difficult, as you point out, for people to be able to protest. We're already seeing people getting arrested. Putin's got rid of most of the opposition. Either they're sitting in jail like Navalny, or they've been rolled up and exiled. There is still voices of dissent. There's clearly people not feeling good about this, and some being brave enough to protest, but there's probably very little that they can do. I mean, it's really if the hard men around Putin start to push back, perhaps because they start to lose. I think really it's going to have to come from external pressure and pushback. and it's not looking particularly hopeful at the moment. Mark and I were, talking beforehand about China, and the role of other countries. It's not going to be sufficient if it's just the United States standing up and saying this is wrong, or, the French and the Germans suddenly waking up. They're going to have to take much more drastic action. It's not just going to be an issue of sanctions, but about how we comport ourselves and how other countries, make their displeasure felt. This is going to be very difficult. I mean, many people, myself included, have been out there warning about that this was coming, for weeks and for months, and we would actually have to buckle up and, really start to think that we're going to be in for the long haul here. And that's the only way that we start to change things. So we're going to have many more of these discussions, and many more of kind of speaking out about this. I just hope that everybody who's listening to this will go out and speak out about this, and about how, talking to all the Russians that and all the other, Europeans that and the Japanese and Chinese and Indians and everything else, the students and officials, we've got to speak out and say, no, look, multiple wrongs don't make a right. The United States has made lots of mistakes. Expansion of NATO was probably not a good idea. All of the counterfactuals of what might have happened and whose fault of it is moot. Vladimir Putin is basically pummeling Ukraine into submission. There's nothing right about this.
Ambassador Boucher, are you on the line? Would you like to come off?
Ambassador.
Yeah.
Right.
If I can, am I here?
Of course. Yep, you're in.
Okay. So this idea that he's trying to keep Ukraine from leaving the franchise or the Dominion sort of also then raises the question, so what's his idea of the areas over which he should have control? And is he trying to reestablish the Soviet Union? Is he trying to create a universe of Russian speakers extending into Central Asia as well? Is he trying to reestablish the Warsaw Pact as a protection for Moscow? How big is his ambition?
Well, I don't think he's trying to myself coming up here. Shall I speak again? We okay? Can everyone hear? Yeah. So I don't think he's trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union per se, but I do think, Ambassador Boucher, and your reference there to sort of the Russian world, the Russian-speaking world, there is a very strong element of that there, the Ruski Mir, because he's already talked about it many times and has made it very clear that he thinks that Belarus, Ukraine, as you say, potentially northern Kazakhstan, the Russian-speaking areas of Moldova, Transnistria, are definitely within Russia's orbit, and that Russia has the right to protect Russian speakers and the right to protect its citizens, because many have been given passports. We've seen this happen before in Georgia with Abkhazia and South Ossetia as well, not just in Donbass in the run-up to this conflict. And whether he's going to incorporate them all the way back in formally into Russia is another matter. But I think we're certainly seeing with Ukraine and Belarus, and what we saw with Crimea and with the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk, there's certainly an intent to potentially annex more territory, but certainly to bring these countries much closer into Russia's orbit, in the sense of being able to control decision-making. They have veto power, have governments of his choosing in place. I mean, clearly in terms of control, he obviously intends to unseat Zelensky and have a Moscow puppet government put in place. And then the extent of his ambitions, I fear, extends indeed to much of the old former Russian imperium, and where he can actually have governments that are either fearful of him and then pliant and compliant, or if he actually can in fact swear, and he thinks obviously that the United States does this all the time, which is obviously a misreading of the way that most of these things are working, where he can actually make sure that when the government leaders get up every morning, they think of Moscow and not of Brussels or the United States. When it comes to the Warsaw Pact, I'm not sure that he's trying to reconstitute that. He is trying to get equivalency between the CSTO, which you're well aware of, the sort of poor man's version of the Warsaw Pact that includes Belarus, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and a handful of other countries in addition to Russia, which is not the old Warsaw Pact, but to get equivalency for that with NATO, which is no equivalency. I mean, that is really countries that have been sort of forced into close military alliance with Russia, in particular countries like Armenia, where Russia has bases and all of the kind of border guards there in place. But he does seek, as he's now making very clear with Ukraine, the demilitarization of the countries on his borders. And of course, the demands that were made in these two documents that were sent to the United States government and to NATO in December of 2021, demanding that Ukraine and Georgia and other former Soviet states are all in NATO, that NATO roll back to the positions in terms of deployments and force structures that were held prior to 1997 at the United States, poor men, equipment, missiles, out of Europe, Eastern Europe for sure, but can go much broader than that. Any kind of territory that's within striking distance or hailing distance of Russia, it also actually that extended to the Asia Pacific. They've made it clear since to Japan and Okinawa and other bases and positions that the United States have. He's making it very clear that his ambitions go much further. And what we're now hearing is it wasn't just the neutrality of Ukraine, and I've been saying this all along, that he wanted the demilitarization and the neutering of Ukraine. And I just want to kind of make a little point here that clearly, all the people were talking before about, well, let's kind of give him, all of these kinds of things, and let's talk about Finlandization and, look at Austria after 1955. That would have been no protection whatsoever for Ukraine. Because I mentioned Ireland before, and Northern Ireland, when I was talking, in response to what Tony Levitt has said. Ireland is neutral since the Republic of Ireland, since getting its independence in the United Kingdom. And the Russian military, the Air Force constantly buzzes Ireland's airspace. And most recently, in the run-up to this crisis, they did naval exercises in and around Ireland, in Ireland's recognised coastal waters in its economic zone, and had to be sort of shown off by Irish trawlers, fishermen, because it's not like the Irish have, this major navy. And then the Irish government got a note of complaint from the Russian foreign ministry accusing them of aggression. Now, what's Ireland got to do with aggression towards Russia? Ireland is completely neutral. And the only expansive part of Ireland that the Russians can complain about is the ubiquitous Irish pub, Guinness, and Kerrygold butter that you used to sort of see in Russian stores. So it's hardly as if Ireland is in any way threatening Russian interests, and Russia was in Irish coastal waters. So that turns neutrality into a complete mockery and makes it very clear that what Russia really wants is to be able to, in its ambitions, Ambassador Boucher, to be able to lord it over anyone it pleases.
Thanks. That's a sad answer.
Yes.
And a difficult one. Yeah.
Mark, we can't hear you now because when you got the double thing, turned yourself off.
Rookie error. I'm going to pass over Jack Fanning's question because I think we just covered it. Sorry about that, Jack. We've got 3 people. We're going to go another 15 minutes. I'm going to call on Jeff Colgan to unmute himself first. Thank you.
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can, Jeff. Yeah. Hi.
Oh, great. Dr. Hill, thank you so much for joining us today. And I think when we're in a situation like this, calling on experts of Russian and Ukrainian politics like yourself is so helpful. But in the spirit of nobody has a monopoly of knowledge on these types of things, I wanted to ask you about oil and energy politics, and in particular, I wrote a book in 2013 called Petro-Aggression, and the basic thesis of the book is that oil money can enable foreign military adventurism by various leaders because it allows them enormous resources for both kind of domestic politics in terms of avoiding constraints that might otherwise be on them, and by expanding their military capabilities. And the book is mostly about Middle East politics, but I can't help but see some reverberations in Putin's Russia. And so, in Russia's case, and here's the question, in Russia's case, this is mostly European dollars that have flown into Russia for not only oil, but also natural gas. And so is there, in your view, some sense that from Europe that this is this is a war that they paid for, that there's European money at work here.
Well, it ought to be. And in fact, Mark and I were talking about this just before, Jeff, so I'm really glad that you raised this. Because as you say, it's oil, it's also gas. We've all been obsessed about Nord Stream 2, but that's Nord Stream 2. There is Nord Stream 1 that is presumably still flowing. And there are, of course, the energy pipelines that go across not just Ukraine, but Belarus, from the Soviet era. The United States has been pointing out since the 1960s, when they were first planned, that at some point this would be used as leverage. And exactly as you say, that the revenues from oil and gas sales, oil is more fungible on the global market, and the United States has been buying Russian oil as well, and probably still is as we're speaking, that this would indeed be bolstering the revenues of the Soviet and then the Russian state. And Putin does in fact think that he has a war chest, because part of the reason that he made the Russian state solvent, as I was mentioning in the overview, in that first period of his presidencies from 2000 to 2008, was that oil, and then bringing along with it gas prices, soared from $10 a barrel to 100 and over $100 a barrel. And he was able to use that to pay off all of the debts, which he did early, including the sovereign debt and the Paris Club debt, and then able to put a lot of that into military revival, modernization of the military forces, buying new equipment, developing novel nuclear weapons. And now, as we speak, and we look at what he's doing in Ukraine, he's got a massive military budget that he can dip into. And he also thinks that he's sanction-proofed the economy sufficiently that he can do this for quite a while, and eventually we will get over it, because we need Russian oil and gas. And Mark, you had a figure that you mentioned to me earlier about some.
Yeah, and Adam Two's calculated that in the past week, the basically everyone who buys oil and gas from them, the combined bill that went to Russia last week was $700 million. So that's 1 week. So they are absolutely paying for the war.
Yeah, and it makes your point. And it's not just that. It's long grain timber that is used, for pulp and paper. It's scrap, well, not scrap metal. I think they've sold it all by now, but there's, kind of metals and, ores, potash. Well, Belarus was a major producer of potash, but also so was Russia for fertilizer. And then, which is also pretty scary, grain. And one thing that we've been missing here, but it fits into your point about commodities, is that the three largest, grain producers in the world, apart from the United States and Canada, are not, of course, surprisingly, Russia, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, with those northern parts of Kazakhstan that came up in a previous question. And most of that grain goes out through the Black Sea. So there's a lot of people who are very concerned that really what Russia is trying to do is also manipulate the grain trade, because an awful lot of that grain goes out of not just places like Odessa, and going to places like Syria and Yemen and all the parts of Africa that are really suffering now from food security, into things like the World Food Programme and other. So, we're going to have a serious knock-on effects here. But also coming out of the Sea of Azov, where it's the Russian port of Taganrog, but also Mariupol, the port that is now under major threat as part of that Donetsk and Luhansk ambitions to expand out to the full administrative borders of those two breakaway regions. So not only are you right on those issues there, Jeff, on oil and gas, but it's like the broader commodities that which of course Russia has been known for back in the imperial past. Odessa being the fastest growing city in the whole region, the center of the grain trade in 1900, and remaining one of those major Black Sea ports. Odessa being under siege now also by the Russians and the Russian Navy. So this is a disaster on many fronts, and absolutely an awful lot of other people have paid for this war and will be paying now because of this war, because of higher grain prices, commodity shortages, higher oil and gas prices, and the Russians benefiting from this.
Wow. Michael Kennedy, your turn.
Well, thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Good.
Michael,
So thank you so much. This was such a wonderful occasion. Just a question. Does the difference between the lands once associated with the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Poland and those associated with Tsarist Russia matter in this scenario that you're developing and that led to the crisis? And what now will be its sequel?
Well, we'll see, because Putin has at different points when he's been talking about Ukraine, going back to 2008, made the point that, you know, Ukraine is not a real country, which he continues to make. Part of it was in Eastern Europe and part of it was given to us. And those parts that were in Eastern Europe are the parts that you're describing of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And Hungary actually has some claims on some of those lands around the city and region of Uzhhorod, where there's a Hungarian-speaking minority. And at various points, the lovely Viktor Orban, Prime Minister of Hungary, who recently, getting back to Jeff's point, was most definitely paying for this war, goes off to Moscow just on the eve of conflict and signs a new deal for cheap gas just ahead of his re-election bid. About cynical as you absolutely can get, has often talked about the genocide against the Hungarian speakers in Ukraine. And at different points, you know, the Russians have actually offered, including in 2015 at the Munich Security Conference, in a really outrageous speech by Foreign Minister Lavrov that I happened to be sitting in the audience for, when he talks about Ukraine being, you know, basically a sum of many different parts, and starts enumerating all of the various minorities in Ukraine that, you know, he's kind of implying are being persecuted in some way: Polish speakers, German speakers, Hungarian speakers, Slovaks. You know, it goes on and on. It's almost as if he's inviting, you know, the various European leaders to kind of come in and take a piece of Ukraine. This is after the annexation of Crimea and the war in the Donbass. So we'll see, you know, whether, you know, Russia intends to carve up Ukraine and, you know, offer some Ukraine either to a rump state of Ukraine, you know, following some of the old cleavages and lines, or whether they just intend to try to, you know, basically watch the whole place fall apart and leave it with a, you know, kind of a smattering of small statelets, satraps, one might kind of say, from an earlier period that are completely and utterly dependent on somewhere else and on Russia, and no unified country of Ukraine as we've recognized it for the last 30 years. Clearly, Putin's moving in. There's been explosions seen in and reported in Western Ukraine as well. So it's not just the Kiev and the eastern part of Ukraine. And the southern part of Ukraine actually for many years was under the Ottoman Empire. And it's the parts that Russia expanded into under Catherine the Great. And the history of Ukraine is indeed a very complex history, but so is the history of most countries, including the United Kingdom that Mark and I are both from. You know, the borders of different parts of the United Kingdom have shifted over many periods of time. And in fact, Scotland only became fully part of the United Kingdom around the same time as Peter the Great defeated the armies of the Swedish King Charles XII at the Battle of Poltava. So, I mean, there's really very few countries that one can say in the world are still existing within their historical borders. So this is why whatever he's deciding to do with Ukraine is a massive threat to the international system and ought to be treated as such. And, you know, we're always saying, but I'm not afraid to make that comparison, that one should never make a comparison with Hitler, because, of course, a huge part of that equation is the Holocaust and the devastation of the Jewish population of Europe. But if we look at the Anschluss of Austria, the seizure of the Sudetenland, the invasion of Poland, the idea of Lebensraum, you know, invasions of Denmark and Norway, and, you know, basically then Stalin gets in on this and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. We're looking at what Putin is doing right now.
Edward Steinfeld, I think you're coming in for possibly the last question. We'll see if we can sneak in one more.
Fiona, thank you so much for this great discussion and your phenomenal book. So my question is, what happens if Donald Trump returns to the presidency in 2024? What are the implications for Putin's ambitions? What are the implications for the viability of NATO? And do you think that is part of Putin's bet now?
Well, I do think it's actually part of Putin's bet. I think he wants to get ahead of that, because he doesn't just want everything to sort of fall apart and then it be a free-for-all. He wants to have the terms of our surrender and somebody there to sign a treaty. And what he learned with Donald Trump is, yeah, fantastic. You know, Trump was going to pick apart NATO. Trump wasn't wrong, by the way, that Mark and I were talking about this before the discussion here, that, you know, basically Trump was right that NATO wasn't really viable as a collective defense organization if people weren't paying their dues to NATO and 2% of GDP, and in real terms, not just doing it through the pension plans of their militaries or the equivalent of the Veterans Administration that we do also in our military budget. What you actually have to do is have proper fighting power. And that basically if NATO was an insurance company, it wasn't good for the catastrophe that people are insuring themselves against if it wasn't in fighting form. And when Putin was looking at NATO, he was taking that bet that insurance wouldn't come due. And of course, Trump has already said to all of the members of NATO, if Russia is really the threat, then why are you making these billion-dollar deals for Russia with gas? Germany, he's looking at you. And why aren't you paying your 2% in military terms? Why is it that the United States is always the one that's dominating the heavy lift or this particular kind of equipment? And it's not sufficient for European leaders to say, well, we're doing all this humanitarian efforts, or in the French case, we're doing operations in the Sahel, etc. Trump was absolutely right in calling them all out, but as you're suggesting, he wasn't really a friend of NATO. He wanted to dismantle it, and his view was, if the United States was carrying NATO, then really everybody else should pay. And he was actually going to turn the United States military, in many respects, into a kind of a pay-as-you-go security relationship. And Putin would not have liked one little bit Trump moving troops out of Germany into Poland, and then basically having the Poles pay, not just for Fort Trump, but for basically having United States troops on their soil. So, there were various things that Trump was doing that Putin liked, but other things that he didn't like at all, because Putin did not, of course, want to see any expansion of US defensive posture anywhere, even if it's particularly paid for. And also, Trump had no sense of history. He had no kind of sense of any of the agreements and things that had been made before. Although he actually did want to have an arms control deal with Putin, what Putin wanted was a deal about European security that recognized Russia's preeminence in Europe. And Trump was not the kind of person who'd be able to sit down and do that with him. Now, he thinks that Biden, being a transatlanticist, being somebody who understands the great sweep of all of the agreements that have been made in the Cold War, is somebody who could possibly, this is what basically Putin wants, is to sit down and agree on the terms of surrender for Ukraine, because that's what he's asking for right now, and for NATO. It's the demands that he's put forward in these documents, and for how the US disposition of forces is going to be. And what he's doing is escalating to get us to that point, taking control of Ukraine, menacing us all with nuclear weapons. He's serious about that one, by the way, because we've seen them exercising with tactical nuclear weapons. He wants to scare the hell out of all of us. And he's basically trying to intimidate us all into submission. And then he's hoping before Trump comes back and everything goes chaotic and haywire, he'll have some kind of treaty that kind of looks like maybe the Treaty of Andrusova or Poltava. Some people are even quipping they'll want to do it in Poltava, or, kind of the Yalta or some other mechanism of surrender where the big powers, the United States and France and Germany and maybe the UK, will all sign something away for him. And that hopefully President Biden, who understands all of these things, will do it. And he wants to get ahead of our midterms, and he wants to get ahead. This is a very grim picture, I know, that I'm painting, but you can really kind of see in the way that he's behaving is that is kind of what he wants. And then he would be ahead of the whole game where Europe falls apart and the United States is totally out of the picture, because if Trump comes back, we are finished as any kind of moral authority or any kind of force, and we certainly wouldn't be able to get the Europeans or anybody else to go along with us. So there you have it. And that's one of the reasons why, people are saying, why didn't he do this under Trump? Well, there's all kinds of reasons why he didn't. He might have didn't feel that he needed to at the time. He was kind of watching how things were playing out. But then it looked like, Ukraine was getting away and moving away from the franchise. And he wasn't really quite sure what Trump was up to half the time. And he was obviously biding his time to see whether Trump would come back into office or not. I mean, he was Trump. Putin stayed a while before he recognized Biden and congratulated him as the president. He was watching and waiting to see how things were going to unfold. And then when he saw the way they were going, he decided to move. I think he's had this contingency to retake Ukraine for a very long time.
Unfortunately, we're out of time, which seems to be a dreadful way to end this on such a dispiriting note.
Sorry.
But I guess we are out of time, metaphorically and for real, on this call. Thank you very much for joining us, Fiona. It's been a great conversation. Thank you to everyone who put in questions and for everyone who was on the call in general. So sorry, Lee and Alice, we didn't get to your questions, but we are out of time, unfortunately. And that's that. Thank you. And we will be back soon. Keep looking at the Rhodes page for our upcoming events. We've got a whole bunch of really interesting people coming through soon, and I hope to see you on the next next call, or even in person. Imagine that.
Yeah, I'm sorry not to see you in person, but I am really here.